Making it upstairs because I believe every one of you was downstairs, like myself, at 5:30. First of all, I'd like to thank ICES for allowing me to fill up this first hour on the second day of the conference. I really appreciate it, and I'm very, as they say in Australia, I'm stoked to be here. Oh, chuffed. And secondly, thank you, Young Out, for the kind introduction to my talk. So I have been working in fisheries science, or as a behavioural scientist, in trying to predict fisher behaviour and fisher outcome for the last 15 years. And in doing that, I've realised that the human dimension of fisheries science has really increased in prominence over the last 15 years. And it's evidenced here in ICES, for instance. In ICES, we now have the working group for social sciences with Lisa and with Marloes Kraan, who are here. We have the working group in economics with Anne Heine and Olivier Thibault and Jörn Schmidt. And so ICES has really sort of integrated this human dimension into the way they operate. And this is also evidence in the group that I'm working in the ecosystems modelling group. Even though I'm still the only social scientist in a group of biologists and ecosystem people, I think that we're sort of making our way. So over these same 15 years, something that I've also noticed is there's been an increase in terms of the number of publications on the unintended consequences of fisheries management, the way we manage our fisheries. So, and that's basically what my talk is about. But the reason I say that there's been an increase, since the 1980s, there's been an increase in the number of citations on unintended consequences. So just last year, there was over 10,000 citations on this topic. So my premise is that we must become better at anticipating these unintended outcomes of fisheries management. And one way we can do that is by using the behavioural sciences better. So we're already using economists and we're using social scientists, but we need to also use behavioural scientists like psychologists, etc., and using knowledge from those fields. So most of you can probably think of an unintended consequence of a regulation in fisheries. So something where we implemented a regulation and something unexpected happened that either was a negative outcome of this regulation. And I'll be talking about some of those negative implications of these regulations in this talk. But my favourite example of a negative unintended outcome is actually not from fisheries, but it comes from, it's called the Streisand Effect. And for those of you who don't know, Barbara Streisand was a singer and performer in the last century. She has a beautiful property in Malibu in California on the beach. And in 2003, an internet company called Pictopia.com, they published a photo of her property on the internet. And one of the things that obviously revealed where her property was, and she didn't like it, so she decided to sue this internet company. Before she sued, a total of 6 people had downloaded the picture on the internet. Within the time that she sued, a total of 420,000 people had downloaded this same picture. Because obviously, if you're not allowed to see something, you'll go and search it out. So one of the unintended consequences of her suing this company for publishing this picture was that everyone saw the picture. Now, if she had thought about her management approach to dealing with this problem she had, she might have taken a different approach. So in fisheries, we test our different management approaches using management strategy evaluation. And as Andre Putten often says, management strategy evaluation is a fisheries flight simulator. It basically allows you to evaluate the different management strategy options of fisheries. Now in these fisheries, in these models that we use for management strategy evaluation, they're very sophisticated. They're very sophisticated in terms of the biology and the ecology. However, when it comes to the social behaviour of fishes and even the economic behaviour of the people in the models, it's not always as sophisticated. And this is often referred to in this modern modelling context as implementation error. So you implement a policy and you have some error in there. That's usually because the people in the model don't quite behave the way that you think they might behave. So in a way, implementation error is analogous to unintended consequences of regulations. So this is what my talk is about. And in the next, the rest of my talk, first I'll just give you a bit of a definition of what unintended consequences are, and I'll give you a framework to show you that there's different types of unintended consequences. I'll also give you some background of where the term comes from, and then I'll give you the reasons for these things happening, and I'll give you 3 examples of where the behavioural sciences can teach us how to deal with these unintended consequences. So knowing something about the way that people behave can help us in this. So firstly, what is an unintended consequence? It's an outcome that is not the one that was foreseen by purposeful management action. So I say purposeful management action because we implement regulations with the aim of achieving some objective. And so a policy or a regulation is implemented with the end point in mind. So we purposefully do these, and we expect outcomes at the end. So an example of an unintended consequence from marine protected areas. There was a very recent paper in PNAS by McDermott et al. And they talked about an area in the Pacific called Phoenix Island, where a marine reserve was being established. And they realised when the marine reserve was actually implemented that 2 years before the marine reserve was implemented, people started fishing the area harder. They called it preemptive fishing, or preemptive overfishing, sorry. So basically, because the people in the local communities knew there was going to be a reserve established there in 2 years' time, they started to fish it really hard. So it actually meant that the starting point for the marine reserve was much worse than it might have been if the implementation had been immediate. So in this paper, the unintended consequence was this preemptive overfishing in this reserve. Now, a recent survey we did in Tasmania, we asked fishers about unintended consequences, and this was one of the quotes of one of the fishers. He said, "While the experts tell us that there's all of these negative outcomes are unexpected or unforeseen, it's rubbish. It was all inevitably going to happen." Basically implying that if we as scientists had asked them, or have been more careful in trying to figure out what their behavioural adjustments might be, sort of behavioural opportunities that these fishers see, and in relation to that marine reserve, obviously there was 2 years of behavioural opportunity to go fishing it much harder than it might have been if it hadn't been revealed before that time. So this fisherman was basically telling us, look, ask us or think about it more carefully. And I think that's something that we have to remember. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page what unintended consequences are, they're not the same as trade-offs. So trade-offs is basically where you're balancing two desirable but incompatible outcomes. So for instance, when you're looking at a marine reserve, you might have environmental objectives because you want that area to be biologically sort of sustainably managed, so you have an environmental outcome. The economic outcome the economic objective for that marine reserve might not be able to be achieved. So you might not be able to get an environmental outcome and an economic outcome by establishing a marine reserve. So you have to balance the two. So that's basically a trade-off. It's not the same as an unintended consequence. It's also not the same as Murphy's Law. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Murphy's Law. It might sort of be an English thing, but basically it says that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. It's not that either. It's basically, I think of unintended consequences as behavioural opportunities. So people basically behaving in a rational way and circumventing the rules. Not breaking the rules necessarily, but behavioural adjustments that circumvent the rules. So that's what I've defined unintended consequences are. So just to go back, where does this term actually come from, and where does it come from for me? In 2011, Beth Fulton led a paper that was entitled Human Behaviour, the Key Source of Uncertainty in Fisheries Management. And some of you may have read this paper in Fish and Fisheries. It went through quite a torturous review process, and we got it back a few times, and one of the comments we got back in the review process was, how come you haven't referenced the term unintended consequences? And I was the social scientist on the paper, so I was responsible for that, using that term. And I didn't realise that the term was actually, if you like, owned by someone. So I frantically went and looked in the literature and found out that there was a gentleman by the name of Merton in 1936 who basically coined, named and popularised the term unintended consequences. So Robert Merton, he was an American sociologist, and he wrote an essay called The Unanticipated Consequences of Social Action. So he used the word unanticipated, but unintended was the word that became popular. Unanticipated sort of disappeared in the literature for some reason that I don't know of. So Robert Merton received a Nobel Prize in 1997, and he's most famous for another term, which is basically he was famous for a role model, for a reference group, and for some other terms that he sort of coined. In fact, unintended consequences. So if you ever intend to use the term in your papers, please make sure you reference Mr. Merton or Dr. Merton. There's, as I said in my introduction, there's different types of unintended consequences. So what I've tried to do here is to give you a frame within which you can look at this. So if you think about your original management goals, so you say you have an objective of establishing marine reserve and you want environmental outcomes. So you can either achieve that intent or you can fail in that intent. So there's two possible outcomes there in terms of your management. And so then on top of that, there are the unintended consequences of your management. Now these can be good and this can be bad. Now mostly when people think about an unintended consequence, they think of the bad ones, because we're better at thinking about where things go wrong than we are at thinking about where things go right. So I've given you some names. So where you achieve your management intent but something bad happens, which is what usually the case is, I've called it collateral damage. Now you can also, where you don't actually achieve what you set out to achieve and something bad happens in addition, that's what Barbara Streisand basically experienced there. That's called a perverse result, or the Streisand Effect. And then we have the things that something good happens, and we don't write about these. And somebody, I can't remember who it was yesterday, said we must talk more about where things go right. We must think about the positives. And in this context as well, we have to think about the fact that if we have something good happen, then we need to write about those. So when I started to look around for some examples, it was very difficult to come up with examples of where you get a bonus, so where something good happens, or where you get a consolation prize, but I did find some. So I'll give you two examples of the first one of collateral damage and the second one of the consolation prize. Sorry, this slide is a little bit crowded, but basically the example I want to give you is a little bit contentious possibly, but it's about co-management. Now in many contexts, co-management is very successful. TERFs work really well, where people are working together to manage marine reserves that can have really very good outcomes. The example I want to give you is where co-management has been combined with a situation where we have total allowable catches and individual tradable quota, or catch shares, they're often referred to as well. So total allowable catches are implemented with the objective of achieving environmental outcomes, and they do that very well. Tradable catch shares are implemented with the aim of achieving economic objectives, and they also do that really, really well. They basically, if you implement tradable catch shares, people will start trading these catch shares, and the most efficient fishers will remain in the fishery, and the less efficient fishers will eventually bail out. So we know that that works well. Co-management is a situation where mostly in Western countries, and we have this in Australia, and we have this in New Zealand, and in other places around the world, where we have annual reviews of the catch shares. In these annual reviews, we have many people in the room, including the stakeholders. But what's happening if you combine the three is that because the economic efficiency works so well, and there's usually a concentration of ownership. For instance, in New Zealand, 80% of the quota is now owned by 5 large companies. So the people who are around the table in the room change over time. And in some cases, there's an increasingly powerful number of people who are represented in this room. And that can create some power inequities and obviously power imbalances and self-interest. So this is one of the potential unintended consequences. And what I should say is that there's increasing empirical evidence that this sort of might be happening around, particularly in Australia. So in these annual reviews, these power interests are actually sometimes creating a situation where they put upward pressure on the setting of the total allowable catch levels. So that's an example of where you can have collateral damage, and potentially a little bit of a contentious one. An example of a consolation prize. So this was the one where they didn't achieve the outcomes that were intended, but something good happened. And this is an example from Western Australia. There's a beautiful marine reserve area there called Ningaloo. And in Ningaloo, the Western Australian government spent a lot of money to basically increase the science uptake into policy. What they wanted to do was to use the science more that was being created by the research. So they spent millions of dollars trying to increase, to do evidence-based decision making. So my colleague Chris Vodanovic, he went to this area and actually looked whether that had actually happened. And it turned out that there had been no increase in science uptake into policy. So evidence-based decision making, there was no evidence of that. What had, however, happened was that because there had been so much activity in terms of science in this local community, and a lot of the citizens had become involved in doing this science, that the trust in the science for the local communities that are adjacent to this Ningaloo area had really increased. They trusted the science, and by implication, they also trusted more the way that the reef was being managed. So even though the government wasn't actually using the information in their decision making, the local communities trusted them more to do the right thing by the reef. So that's an example of a consolation prize in terms of unintended consequences. So now I get to the next step. Why do these things happen? And I've taken this from the literature and sort of combined it into a list of reasons. So first of all, one of the reasons why unintended consequences happen is basically what I've called ignorance. So it's either a lack of information, where there's inaccurate information, or the information simply conveyed in the wrong way. This is one of the reasons why unintended consequences can happen. The next one is actually willful ignorance. Now this is different to ignorance because it's where you actually know the information's there but you decide to ignore it. So this sort of information's obvious, this sort of ignorance is often associated with politicians. So where they might have they might know that something is going to happen, but they're going to make the decision anyhow. But we as scientists are guilty of this as well, because there's lots of science going on in different disciplines, and we often know that this science goes on in different disciplines, but we don't use it. We don't tap into that science. The next one, and that's a huge one, and unfortunately I haven't got the time to talk about it in this particular talk, but complexity. And those that are modelers in the room know that this is a big reason for unintended consequences happening. So this is basically about the unknowability of the information, or the time inconsistency. And the last one is one that is also attributable to Dr. Merton, and he called it a self-defeating prediction. And this example actually happened in relation to that preemptive overfishing example that I gave from the marine protected area, because the information was revealed, and it basically defeated the aim. And the last one is called, basically, that's a big area, and this is where the social scientists are really strong, is the influence of basic values on the way we interpret information. So social norms, attitudes, and cultural landscapes, for example. So complexity and ignorance are the main reasons for unintended consequences. And in fact, so if you sort of summarise these different reasons, then you can say that the first four are really about the quality of available information and how it's used, and the last one is about the way we interpret the information. And I'll be using that last one to give you some examples of unintended consequences and how the behavioural sciences can help better anticipate these unintended consequences. And these examples are related to conservation, recreational fishing, and compliance-related issues. So at the moment there's over 15,000 marine protected areas around the world, and just over 7% of the global oceans are protected by marine reserves. Just over 2% are no-take zones, and so there's a fair, we can do much better, but there's a fair chunk already stashed away, if you like. So compliance, the instrumental explanation of compliance is very powerful. So we comply with the rules basically for two reasons: that we are aware of the risk of being detected and the implication, the severity of the sanction. So if you have a high risk of being caught and the fine is really high, then the deterrence is higher and we're more likely to comply. So that's the main reason in which compliance usually gets explained. But it's more complicated than that, and I'll hopefully show you why that's the case. And for that, I'm going to the Great Barrier Reef, and I'm going to give you an example of compliance research in the Great Barrier Reef and how knowing about people's values actually helps explain compliance behaviour. And we have a very eminent person who was involved in the Great Barrier Reef establishment of all the marine reserves, John Day, sitting in the back there, who I briefly talked to yesterday. And one of the things that you said, John, was that most people are now, there's a new normal in the Great Barrier Reef, that most people are very accepting of the fact that the green zones are there, that it's being protected. So it was a really torturous process to actually establish the reserves, but now it's the new normal, if you like. So the example I want to give you is that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is the authority that's responsible for managing the reef. So they're responsible for compliance in the reef, and they're also responsible for things like communicating the benefits of the reef as well. So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority had a campaign to inform people of the benefits of the outcomes of marine reserves. So what they told people was, look, these green zones, as we call them, the no-take areas, are really successful. Within the green zones there's bigger fish, there's more fish, and there's different fish. There's many more different sorts of fish. And they assumed that this would help people comply with the rules more, that it would convince them that these green zones were working and so that they were going to follow the rules. But it didn't actually quite work out that way, because what turned out was that the fishers who were doing the poaching, when our colleagues from JCU asked them, why do you poach? They said, well, because these green zones, they're really good. The fish are bigger, there's more of them, and there's greater diversity. So one of the things that the Great Barrier Reef was communicating was actually these poachers were saying, well, why wouldn't you? So, but obviously this is one of the reasons they were poaching, but it's more complicated than that. There was something about these poachers that made them do that. And this is where we're going to just briefly talk about people's values. To look at values or social norms, I just want to go back to the literature or to the theory just very briefly to explain the background of you. So this theory of behaviour, there's many theories of behaviour from economics, from social science, from psychology, etc. But this is one theory from social science that's very powerful, and I'm just going to build it up. So it starts off with the theory of reasoned action, which is very simply that we behave in a way, we're driven by an intention to behave in a way, and our intention to behave in a way is guided by our attitudes towards the behaviour and our subjective social norm. So an attitude is basically a positive or a negative evaluation of the behaviour, and a social norm is the social pressure we feel to behave in a certain way. So it's quite simple. So these two things, attitudes and social norms, will determine what they call the behavioural intention, or the subjective probability that a person will engage in a certain behaviour, and that leads to behaviour. So this is a simple theory that was developed by Ashton and Fishbein in 1980. In 1991, Ashton added a note to it. He said, well, attitudes and subjective social norms will guide behaviour, but there's also such a thing as perceived behavioural control. We have to have control over behaviour that we want to that we want to display. So, and my friend and colleague Greta Pexel gave a good example of this. She said, every morning I want to go to yoga. I have the right attitude, the social norm, all my friends are saying I should go to yoga, but I don't go. And it's because I don't have time, basically. So her perceived behavioural control was a lack of time. It can be a lack of money, it can be anything really that makes you either possible or not possible to do that behaviour. So that's called the the theory of planned behaviour, and many of you might know this. So then on top of that, if we blow out the social norm component a little bit more, there's a thing called descriptive social norm and injunctive social norm. So social norms are made up of two things. And the first one is our perception of what people typically do will guide how we feel social pressure. So if we think that most people comply, then we're more likely to comply. So it's what we typically think other people do. Injunctive social norm is really about what we think other people approve of. So if I think that most people approve of poaching, then that will influence the way that I feel this peer pressure. So very simple theory, right? But very powerful. Because going back to the Great Barrier Reef, where these poachers were saying, well, we go fishing in these marine reserves because there's lots of fish, they're bigger and there's more of them. Basically, the poachers overestimated the number of people that were poaching. So, and that's what in cognitive bias speak, this is sort of comes out of psychology, it basically says it's a false consensus. So they thought that a lot more people were behaving in the same way as they were. So and in addition to that, if you went poaching, if you knew someone who poached, then you were very much more likely to overestimate other people poaching as well. So that's called social learning. So if you know someone who poached, then you overestimate that. And then in addition, that even those who didn't poach, they thought that others actually approved of poaching a lot more than in fact they did. So just this simple theory of planned behaviour and blowing about these social norms a little bit can tell us something about why these poachers behaved in this way, which then allows us to do something about it and prevent some of these unintended consequences of this communication by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. Because basically, if you want to break down that false consensus, for instance, if you tell if you let the poachers know that in fact they're really part of a very small minority of people who go poaching, that might actually work to change some of their behaviour. So this is where these theories can help us in finding out how people respond to regulations and compliance. The second example comes from New Zealand, where they did using the same sort of framework. They had two different regulatory approaches to managing recreational fishing. They could implement bag limits or they could implement size limits. So there was two, and they basically wanted to know whether there was any differences in the compliance behaviour with respect to these two different regulatory approaches. So this is that same framework again. When they were talking about daily bag limits, what really mattered to people was the perception of whether other people typically applied. So that's what guided the decision to poach or not, or to comply or not. Whereas when it was about size limits, it was in fact whether other people thought that non-compliance was a bad thing or not. So it was actually the injunctive social norm that guided that behaviour, which was different. And the other thing that happened with that was related to the size limit one is there was a feeling of guilt associated with that particular behaviour. Now, the authors in the paper don't actually explore this particular explanation. They don't actually explain why this may have been the case. They just talk about what you can do about it as a regulator to avoid these unintended consequences. But I sort of have a theory about why that might be the case, and it's that thing where if you have a bag limit, you're basically taking an extra adult. No one will notice it, right? But if you take a smaller fish, then you're actually taking a fish that hasn't been able to produce offspring yet. So there's a feeling of actually influencing the size structure of the population. And this is just my own theory because, as I said, the authors don't explore it in their paper. But so just knowing about social norms can give you some sort of perspective on the different types of regulations. And really what you should be doing is assessing this before you implement these regulations. So, and this is coming to the last part of my talk, but basically what we're trying to do with looking at values and social norms, etc., in relation to regulations, is we want to find different ways of motivating people to change their behaviour. So as you probably all know, there's two ways in which we can motivate people to change their behaviour. The first is punishment, and the second is through reward. And basically this is referred to as the carrot and stick approach, and most of you will be familiar with that. Now there's numerous ways of explaining, of theories of motivation, and I've just quoted Maslow's needs hierarchy theory that's at the top of that, but there's numerous of these. But one of the things that people agree about is that if you change people's behaviour through a reward system rather than a punishment system, people will change their behaviour for much longer. The effects of rewards are much longer lasting than if you punish someone. And it's basically because the decision to comply, for instance, based on reward, is a voluntary one. You have to make it yourself. So in fisheries, we have many different types of reward and punishment-based approaches. So punishment, I've already talked about that a lot, is deterrence, is fines, loss of licenses, and other punishments. So these are in fisheries, these are our main tools, or punishment tools, if you like, or sticks. So then we have rewards, and we have different types of reward-based systems. And reward is not such a good word, but we have market-based systems, and then we have social-based rewards. So when you look at the market-based rewards, we have things like financial incentives, subsidies, levies, bonds and insurances, etc. You can have quotas, that's just a market-based reward system. And you can have catch quotas, spatial effort, revenue quotas, there's different types in that as well, and I'm just giving some examples. There's market access, so you can have certification schemes, eco-labelling and trade barriers. So they're sort of market-based rewards-based systems. And then there's the social-based system. So these work on different components, and it's not a very good sort of term, but basically they work on those attitudes and social norms. And there are things like just simple communication, education, and then there's this thing called nudges. Now, nudges is one of those tools that we use that's been in the news a lot, and there's a lot of people who don't like them because basically nudges are things where we motivate people to change their behaviour imperceptibly. We do it by tricking them, if you like. So a lot of people say it's manipulation. You can't nudge people because they'll be motivated to change their decision, but they don't actually know they're being manipulated. However, if you think about it, we're all being manipulated every day, right? We go into the bottle shop, and the marketers have sorted this out years ago. You basically go to the bottle shop, as they call it in Australia, and you'll be presented with three choices, right? A very expensive bottle of wine at $60, a very cheap one at, say, $8, and then there's one at about $20. So what do? We tend to take the one at $20. But research shows that the $20 bottle is probably the same quality as the $8 bottle. We're just not prepared to buy that $8 bottle. We go for the middle. So that's a nudge, if you like. We're being manipulated to change our behaviour, and every time we go to the shop, we're being manipulated. But in a regulation sort of context, people say, well, you shouldn't be manipulating people's behaviour. But if it's for a bad outcome, I completely agree. And people are then calling it sludging nowadays. It's not called nudging, but it's sludging, where you do the wrong thing. It's a new term in the literature. But if it's for a positive outcome, so if you are nudging people towards a behaviour where they increase their compliance, for instance, surely that can be perceived to be a good thing. So my last example is about recreational fisheries, and I'll be talking about using nudges. For recreational fishing, we're limited in the number of tools we can use to regulate recreational fishing, because recreational fishers don't trade their fish in the market. So market-based tools are not really usable in a lot of contexts in recreational fishing. So we sort of rely on deterrence or punishment, and we can use some of these more social-based terms to make them change their behaviour. So just to give you a background, just a very brief number of examples of nudges. So this is just a typology that we've come up, and I've borrowed this from one of my students. Basically, one of the nudges is called simplification framing. So if you want to lose weight, what you do is you put the same amount of food on a smaller plate, and it appears much bigger. So this is a nudge towards, this is basically framing the problem in a certain way that makes you make a certain decision. The other one is actually changing the physical environment. So by painting some footprints on the ground towards a bin, people will use the bin. It's very simple, but it's very effective. And I'm not familiar with this particular one at the bottom, but basically if you paint something in the men's urinals, then they will aim better in that sorts of problem out, apparently. So that's just an example of the way that you can change the physical environment to get a good outcome. Another one is, and some of you or most of you might be familiar with this particular one, is where you change the policy default. So the famous example is organ donation. In the countries where people were asked to opt in to organ donation, so where you had to tick the box to say, yes, I'm going to donate my organs, there was a very low subscription rate. In the countries where you had to opt out of being a donor, so where you automatically were a donor, but you had to tick the box to not be a donor, the subscription rates was significantly higher, like the order of half as much higher. So the simple explanation for that is that people don't like ticking boxes. They're lazy and they don't like, it's like writing a signature on something, right? You're sort of hesitant to put your signature because you don't know exactly what the implications are. So and this is a very, very effective way to get things to happen. And the last one is social norms. So this comes back to that theory that I showed you before. We can work on social norms, and one of the examples that this one is that if you put a sign up that says take your litter home, your mates do this same thing, like other people do as well. Many more people will take their litter home because they're influenced by the fact that everybody else does, so they don't want to be the odd one out. And in Australia they also have this thing called comparisons, where on your electricity bill you will be showing what the rest of the electricity usage in your street is. So if everyone in your street uses less electricity than you want to be conforming to that social norm, so you'll sort of reduce your electricity usage as well. So complying with the social norm is a very effective way to nudge people into doing the right thing. So in recreational fishing, as I said, we have two ways in which we can regulate. We can make people behave in the right way. That's deterrence and using sort of nudges and communication, etc. Now, it's really important in recreational fishing because we don't actually know a lot what's going on in recreational fishing. We don't have a good, firm handle on the number of people that are complying. We don't actually know how much is being fished off them because there's no way of reporting fisheries, etc. So what we did in Australia is we did an economic experiment. So this is one way in which behavioural sciences can really help avoid unintended consequences and help sort of better manage the marine environment. So it's a very simple experiment, and we applied a social norm nudge, if you like. So we tried out whether it would change people's behaviour in recreational fishing. So we gave them an example, a problem. We said, okay, there's 5 fish that you're allowed to catch. Oh, sorry, there's 5 fish you can catch, but really you're only allowed to catch 2 fish. So the legal catch limit is 2, but there's 5 fish in the pond, if you like. And then we said to them, okay, you can go fishing, you can catch, and you have to write down how many fish you're going to catch. And then there's a 5% chance that on your way back from your fishing trip, you're going to come across an inspector, and they will check if you're over the catch limit. So if you've got 3 fish in your basket, then you're going to lose your catch altogether. So you're being caught over the limit, and you're going to lose the financial reward that's associated with that. If you are not checked, then obviously you can take it home. If you've got 2 fish, which is the legal limit, then you can keep it, obviously. Very simple. So then we did 4 treatments. So this was the first treatment. The second treatment is, okay, we apply a nudge. We told them the same story, but then we said, okay, according to last year's data, the average fisher chose to fish only 1 fish. So this was the social norm nudge. And then we repeated the experiment where we increased the deterrence. We said, okay, you can catch 2 legally, but and then we increased from 5% to 20%. So we said, okay, there's now a 20% chance that you'll be caught if you're over the limit. And again, we applied the nudge. So we had 4 treatments, as they call it, in this particular experiment. So the result of that experiment was very simple. If the deterrence is low, so if you are in an area where you're unlikely to get caught, the social norm nudge actually works. So people will respond to the social norm if the deterrence is low. However, if the deterrence was high, so if it was 20% chance of getting caught, then the social norm nudge didn't have any effect at all. And this is logical, right? If you think about it, if you as a regulator, if you're spending a lot of money on implementing deterrence in a particular area, then you might not want to spend extra money on nudging people to do the right thing because they're being deterred enough by those by that high sort of chance of getting caught. So this is my last slide of the talk, and I'm going to try and summarise what I've said and draw some learnings from it. So how can we become better at anticipating the unplanned outcomes of fisheries and ocean management? Well, first of all, not all unintended consequences are negative. So we have to think about the positive things, and we have to start writing about those things as well. It's really important that people learn about those. Not all unintended consequences can be anticipated, but a lot of them can if we use the behavioural sciences and the information value in terms of the social norms and cultural values much better. And if we do experimentation on how people might behave, as that fisherman said, if you'd asked us, we would have told you how we're going to behave and how we're going to preemptively fish in those marine reserves. So most people behave in rational ways to get around the rules, so we can predict a lot of these things. And it's possible to reduce some of those negative outcomes. So behavioural sciences can help to reduce some of these negative outcomes, like non-compliance in marine protected areas and recreational fishing. And by developing a deeper understanding of the influence of basic values and social norms on decision making, these behavioural sciences can be very effective. And that also brings me back to management strategy evaluation. So it can also help reduce that implementation error in our complex models that we use to predict management outcomes. So basically the behavioural sciences, in particular the experimental behavioural sciences, can help to better predict responses to management policies and regulations. They can help better identify response differences for different regulations, which was the example of New Zealand with the catch with the bag limit and the size limit. And it can help find the right balance between deterrence and reward-based behavioural incentives, which was the example in my last one with the experiment that we did in Tasmania. And that was my last slide, and I just wanted to gratuitously advertise 2 other conferences while I'm here. The first one was the IMA conference in Brest next year, and the Open Science, the World Fisheries Congress in Adelaide next year. Thank you.